This is a meeting about water in preparation for our 2024 study on water in Deschutes Basin. And I have a display over there, which I will have to retape, where Kyle gave me this fabulous map of the Deschutes Basin. It shows you springs that you never knew existed. It's very, very detailed. It's hard to read, but enjoy it. On the left side are things about the water study. If you'd like to join our water study, we'd love to have you. And on the right is another thing for Raise the Deschutes, the DRC's program where they have wonderful speakers come in. Kyle spoke to them about Water 101, and you can still see those online. They're always taped. There's a glossary of terms handed out to you at the beginning, hopefully just with some very simple things so that you didn't have to ask Kyle to just explain things like CFS. But we're going to ask you to please hold any questions that are not just like clarifying questions like what does that graph mean or something like until the end, because I know you all have lots of questions and he's got a lot to say. Kyle Gorman and Emily McCain are joining us today from Oregon Water Resources Department, which we always call OWRD, so if you hear that, that's what that is. Kyle's the Regional Water Master for Districts 11, 12, and 17, which include Deschutes, Lake, and Klamath counties. Our District 11 Water Master is Jeremy Giffen, but he's out of town today and can't join us. Kyle's a fifth-generation Oregonian, graduate of U of O with BS in geology. He worked in Bend since 1990. He worked with Bob Main, our legendary water master, and learned a lot and came to love water. It wasn't what he thought he was going to do. He's been a board member of the Deschutes River Conservancy, was a founding member of the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, and is dedicated to restoring the streams and rivers in the Deschutes River Basin to a more natural and improved state. Emily McCain is originally from Eastern Massachusetts and studied conservation biology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's been an Oregon resident since 2012 and works for OWRD in Bend. Her career is in collaborative planning and implementation for environmental resiliency, and she comes to us at the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative. It's finalizing its basin plan, the comprehensive plan. They're both currently very challenging positions that require both a knowledge of water and a knowledge of people and communication with people. And we welcome them. It's so nice of them to come today. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. Okay, we're just doing a little coordination there, and happy to be here. This is a beautiful facility, and kind of a lovely day. Not too bad for November, so it's good to see the snow on the ground. I'm pleased to see that. And so I have some series of slides. Mainly what I'm going to talk about today is the water resources of Central Oregon. A lot of graphs about reservoirs, stream flows, snowpack, drought, more water levels. Kind of just an overview of how we got to the place we are at now given the water supplies that we've seen recently. So that's my hope, is to do that. And then I know you have a lot of questions about things that are not related to the graphs I have. So I fully expect to get those questions at the end. And so not predicting what you're going to ask, but I'm certainly open to those questions. So with that, I guess a couple more things about myself. So I've worked for the Water Resources Department for 3/5 of my life, believe it or not. I started when I was 23 here in Bend, and I've been in Bend my whole career, which is fairly unusual for a state employee. Normally for advancement in positions, you have to move around the state, but I've been lucky enough to be at the right place at the right time with the right attitude, and able to move up in my career with the Water Resources Department. So happy to be here and doing what I do. And again, I'll emphasize that a lot of what I've learned or know about is from Bob Main. So I don't know if you've ever heard of his name, but he was such an incredibly brilliant, forward-looking person. And he had knowledge, he was a scholar, and he was able to talk to the original water master for the basin. And he learned a lot from that original water master, because that water master here watched the reservoirs being built, watched the irrigation districts being built, went through the adjudication. Did Becky have that term on her list? No, she didn't? No, okay, so in Oregon, prior to 1909, a water right goes, if a water right was initiated prior to 1909, it goes through an adjudication process. So if your priority date of your water right, anybody out in the audience have water rights? Oh, you do, okay. So your priority date, if it's prior to 1909, it went through an adjudication process. If it's after 1909, then it goes through the state's application permit and certificate process. So a little difference there, but in the end, priority date comes down to the big meaning of a water right. There's so much, let's see, I was thinking there, what I wanted to say. One of the things also I want to mention is that when I started with the agency in 1990, 91, 92, we were in some really, those were some of the worst droughts we'd seen up until recently. So started out my career in droughts, nearing the end of my career in some pretty major droughts. So that's kind of the theme of today. This picture here is of Sparks Lake. I wish I could have claimed that I took that. I have some similar, but not as good as this one. But Sparks Lake, believe it or not, is essentially part of the headwaters of the Deschutes River. There's no surface water flow from Sparks Lake to the Deschutes River. However, there are some measurements done on Sparks Lake, Devil's Lake, Elk Lake, Hosmer Lake, Lava Lake, and Little Lava Lake. And what the folks noticed back then was that Sparks Lake would fill up at the beginning of the melt, and then the next lake down would fill up, and then each subsequent lake as you go south would fill up and spill until it got to Little Lava Lake. And Little Lava Lake, when it flows, is the headwaters of the Upper Deschutes River. So if anybody's been to Blue Pool, there's a little hiking trail to Blue Pool. That's the headwaters of the Deschutes, the surface water portion of it, if you didn't know that. So there's the basin there. It's a little over 10,000 square miles. The area that I work in with the water masters, and actually maybe the information I gave Becky about the water master districts was old. We actually have a new water master district, number 24, and it is carved out of the District 11, Jeremy's district, into the Crooked River only. So now we have a Crooked River water master and a Crooked River water master district. And so that would be the south and east part of the Upper Deschutes Basin.
Could I just say,
Yes.
the microphone keeps cutting out.
It does, I noticed that.
I'm wondering if your finger is, if there's a button that turns it on and off, and
Maybe that's
your
what
fingers.
Well, no, it's on the bottom, so
Okay.
I don't know.
I don't know. Sorry.
I really didn't want to use the microphone because of that reason. So, can everybody hear me this way? No? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I'll do my best and work with this technology. Maybe I'll just put it right up to my mouth. Okay. It takes a little bit of getting used to doing this. So anyway, there's the Upper Deschutes Basin. I also work in the Klamath Basin and the majority of Lake County. And so I have a little bit broader area than just the Deschutes River. So a little bit of geology and geography. One of the great things about living in Bend is that our water supply doesn't come from the precipitation that lands on Bend. Thank goodness. Because if that's what we had to rely on, we probably wouldn't even be here. Our water comes from the Cascades, and where you can have over 100 inches of precip a year up there that infiltrates down in that young geology and then makes its way a little south and then circles around under the Lapine Basin, then heads north to Lake Billy Chinook. So all that groundwater all the water that's infiltrates, turns into groundwater, makes its way underneath us here at Bend, and we can tap into that large resource here for Bend in Central Oregon. Snow accumulation. So this graph shows how we've been doing the last couple of years, what our average is, and where are we at relative. So it's kind of hard to see. Does this thing have a pointer on it? Oops. Oh no, I just turned it off. There we go. Okay, good. So this is so there's automated snow-tell sites up in the Cascade Mountains, or actually all over Oregon, all over the West. They are operated by the federal government, Natural Resources Conservation Service. Those sites are telemetered, so they transmit data every couple hours, and then we, as water manager folks, rely on that data and those historic figures to predict how much water supply we're going to have. And so these are critical graphs that we look at, and those come out the first of the month for January through June. And those snowpack indicators give us a good idea of what kind of water supply we're going to have. The NRCS also makes streamflow forecasts. So we look at what kind of forecast we're going to have, now I went out without there's just something wrong with this microphone. So anyway, that snowpack information is, battery says it's good. Well, I guess bear with me, I'm sorry, I don't have any control over this thing. Where am I? Okay, so this is for the Upper Deschutes. So there's about 8 or 9 sites. There's 3 in the Ochoco Mountains, 6, 7 on the Cascade Mountains. They're up in the upper part of the mountain, and they collect that information. This is an assembly of the data and plotted on a graph for averaging. And this green line is the average, and this is water content. So at the peak of the season, April 1st is the peak of the snowpack for the Cascades. And we have roughly about 25 inches of water. One of the things that water folks look at, we don't care how deep the snow is, like Mount Bachelor reports how many inches they have. That's just how deep it is. We care about how much water is in the snowpack. And so this graph represents the melt water in that snowpack. And on average, year in the mountains at all those sites, it's about 25 inches of water. This black line is last year. So we had starts in October 1st, that's the beginning of the water year. And about mid-December, we were in record low territory last year. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be another really bad year. However, end of December, and then into January, we got some really nice precipitation and snow, and we actually went above the average. And then for 3 months, no precipitation last year. It was like, this is horrible. And then it started melting. And it was like, I was just thinking, this is going to be so bad. Thankfully, we got some really nice timed rain and snow late in the spring and recovered the snowpack. But you see that we never really made it up to average. So last year's snowpack was well below average, even though late in the spring there were some numbers reported as being above average. But we ended up not having an average snowpack this last year. But this is an interesting graphic here. So at Crater Lake, there's a long, long history of snowpack and snow depth readings at Crater Lake. In April through May of 2021, it was tied for the lowest snowpack during those 2 months in its recorded history. So 2021, April and May were extremely dry and no precipitation. This year, 2022, we are at the 3rd highest. So from 1 year to the next, 1 year, last year, the worst on record. This year we had a nice, beneficial spring and water supply. So that really changed things around from a couple months what we were expecting. But the change from 1 year to the next is just remarkable. So where are we at as far as drought conditions in the basin? So one of the things that we can do with water resources is we run about 60 stream gauges in the Upper Deschutes Basin. And those stream gauges monitor river flow. We have them on natural streams like Fall River, Quinn River, and some tributaries to Crane Prairie. We also monitor the outflows out of the reservoirs, and then we monitor the canal diversions here in Bend. So the Upper Deschutes Basin is the most gauged basin in the state, believe it or not. and those gauges are run by our department, the Oregon Water Resources Department. The USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, also has roughly 230 stream gauges around Oregon, but they actually have a very light footprint in Central Oregon and South Central Oregon. They focus on the Willamette Basin and Northeast Oregon, where they have the majority of their gauges, as well as Southwest Oregon and the coast. So when it comes to gauging in Central Oregon, it's us, OWRD. With those stream gauges, where I'm going with this is that the folks that declare or look at drought conditions use those stream flow records as a gauge to measure how are we doing in the past. And given precipitation, temperatures, stream flow, reservoir contents, soil moisture, all of that, in March 29th, prior to receiving that nice, wet, cold spring rain. This is the drought, oh shoot. And I better hurry up. This is the drought conditions, D4, exceptional drought. So the worst drought conditions the federal agency designates droughts as. So a big chunk of Central Oregon, South Central Oregon, essentially my region, was the worst drought conditions for the state of Oregon. And then on into California. May, so a couple months later, that area declined a little bit. And then June, the last remaining D4 drought was in the Crooked River Basin or Crook County. And you can see that in this area right here. But the remainder of Central Oregon, South Central Oregon, still in the extreme drought conditions. So even though we did have spring rains, it was nice, it was still a cumulative effect of previous drought years. And it's still lasting now. So it's kind of comical when the newspaper reporter calls me up and says, we get a rain shower or a little bit of rain or snow. Is the drought over? Not yet. Yeah, it took 20 years to get into this position we're in now, and it's going to take a few years to get back out of it. This is what's called the teacup diagram. So this is, the website is run by the Bureau of Reclamation. However, the gauges that we run are represented here. And this is, a lot of folks refer to this website to look at what's going on in the basin. And it's a really good, quick overview of where we're at, what stream gauge you might be interested in. Folks like to raft or fish. People will use these type of gauges to look at how the stream's doing. But in Central Oregon, this was October 26th. Wikiup Reservoir at 10% full, Crescent Lake 8%, Prineville Reservoir at 10%. Ochoco is essentially, it's below the outlet, so it's essentially zero available water for the folks there. And then interesting thing on Haystack Reservoir this year, the outlet gates on the reservoir were broke and they were not operable, so the irrigation district and the Bureau of Reclamation had to drain Haystack Reservoir. So there was a time period, I don't know if anybody made it down there, but you could fish by any method with no limits fishing at Haystack Reservoir. So the district and the Bureau is hoping to get those gates fixed and get that back up, because that's a critical component of North Unit Irrigation District's irrigation system. So it's called it's an in-reservoir system or an inter-district reservoir. It has, the water supplied is from the canals, and then it delivers water to the district. A little tidbit of information about Haystack Reservoir. And then lastly, you might say, oh, Crane Prairie's doing great. Wow, how come that is? Well, Crane Prairie has a new management regime, and it's related to the Oregon spotted frog. Crane Prairie originally was built for irrigation, for the development of the irrigation districts in Central Oregon. However, it is wonderful frog habitat. And under the new Habitat and Conservation Plan, the district said, well, we can give up the use of Crane Prairie if it'll offset the impacts to the spotted frog. And so under the Habitat and Conservation Plan, Crane Prairie is managed for the spotted frog now. So it's held artificially high. If it were prior to the HCP, it would probably be in the same condition as most of the other reservoirs would be. And it has had some impact on Wikiup's levels as well. So, talking about Wickiup Reservoir, in the last 3 years, we have seen some incredibly unusual conditions in that reservoir. It was built in 1947, and the last 3 years, we've seen the lowest levels in Wickiup Reservoir since it was built. Now, going back, the reason why both is from drought and the spotted frog both have impacts on that reservoir. Sometimes I'll be in meetings and I'll hear that this is an artificial drought. And what people mean by that is not so much in Central Oregon, but there are places where there's mandated flows out of a system which depletes water supply. So what the folks are inferring is that it's a man-made drought, artificial drought, and it's because of management. Well, I hear that every now and then, but it is just not so in Central Oregon. The drought that we just experienced, hopefully we're getting out of it, is the worst that anybody's alive has seen in this region. So we've had about a 20-year dry trend of since about 2001, many more dry years than wet years. And so it's one of these climate cycles that we're seeing, but was not expected. This represents the wet cycles. So in 1986, we went through some wet periods. In the 90s when I started, and then in the mid to late 90s. How many people were here in the mid to late 90s? Okay, so we had some severe flooding in Tumalo. Some folks had built houses really close to the floodplain in Tumalo, and the river was roaring, and it was running around their houses and in their driveways, and it was inundated for several months. And it was shocking to everybody how much water there was. So we were in an incredibly wet cycle in 1996, 7, and 8. And then in 1999, we had this humongous snowpack. But then since 2001, it's really been drier than average. And this is reflective in Wickiup's contents. So starting on April 1st, you can see that we're at record low levels of starting in Wickiup Reservoir to start the irrigation season. This is another graph of Wickiup that shows, here's average. So normally it's almost full. Here was last year about half full. And then this year, we're a little above last year. So there's hope that we might be on a trend to change this, to get Wickiup back up. Here's Prineville Reservoir, same graph. Here's average last year, well below average last year. And then, well, actually this is 2021, this would be 2022. I didn't update it because I have my next graph is really neat. So this graph's from the Bureau of Reclamation. And I want to point out that this gray area here, and then the dotted line, that's the median. This gray area is the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, which means that 50% of the time in its historic condition, the reservoir was in this range right here. And so Prineville Reservoir is probably one of the most consistent reservoirs as far as water content goes, anywhere in Central Oregon and probably anywhere in the state. It's incredible how consistent that reservoir is. So when I show you where it is today, it is just inconceivable how low Prineville Reservoir is right now. Again, Crook County being in that exceptional drought condition still remains in exceptional drought condition. So this is a direct effect of those really, really dry conditions. The good thing about Prineville Reservoir and the geology, which is completely different from the geology in the Cascades, the rocks and the soils are very, very fine grained in the Crook River drainage. So if we get a snowpack out there, rain, it runs off immediately. And Prineville Reservoir has a fill percent of average of about 70% each year has a chance of filling. So we can have one big snowpack, one big event, and Prineville Reservoir can recover. Wickiup Reservoir, however, can't because of the groundwater inflow, and it takes a long time to get those springs recharge and getting that reservoir filled up. So there's quite different geology between the two districts. And Crane Prairie Reservoir, you can see that average, and the last year was above average the whole time. So fishing's been good at Crane Prairie, and spotted frogs are doing great. So there's a positive right there. Probably something you're all keenly aware of and has been in the news quite a bit lately, particularly in the Klamath Basin. This graph here is water levels in a well west of Redmond. And people are wondering, well, what's going on about our groundwater system? How's it doing? So not only does the state operate stream gauges and canal gauges, we operate a state observation well network all over the state. We have 50 or 60 wells in Central Oregon that are measured every quarter. And those wells, most of them are actually private wells attached to a home. And so the homeowners have allowed Water Resources Department to go on their property and make a water level measurement. And some of those water level measurements go back to the 60s. There's an observation well on Pine Meadow Ranch that we've been measuring since the 1960s. And it shows an interesting trend. It's different than this. This one I showed more representative of where the majority of folks who have wells and what their well conditions will likely look like if they were to measure their wells. So we go back to about the mid-1970s, and Central Oregon was much less populated in the 1970s than it is now. Much fewer homes in the area, rural areas. But you can see that it had a fairly consistent trend until about 1995, and then we're on this decline down. And this is a representation of about 30 feet of decline over 45 years. And so just a little under a foot per year if you take the whole record. So if somebody, and this was common for wells being drilled in Central Oregon in the 70s and early 80s, was that once a driller hit the water table, they would go just a few feet, maybe 20, 25 feet and stop, being that the knowledge then was that, hey, the Central Oregon's aquifer is very, very stable, it's robust, we don't need to spend any extra money drilling any deeper, we can just stop right here. So there's a lot of wells out there that had about 25 feet of standing water in the bottom of their well. Well, what happens when you have 30 feet of decline? The bottom of the well is now dry. So we've had quite an uptick in the number of dry wells in the area. However, since I've been working for the department, we have dry wells every year. So dry wells isn't something new, it's just that people are more aware of it, and we had a number of uptick of dry well complaints in Central Oregon. But just consider this though, there's over 20,000 wells, domestic wells in Central Oregon, and we had about 60 to 70 complain about them going dry. So it's a small percentage. So it isn't a crisis, it's not everybody, it's just a few. But when I was a kid, I lived on a farm, we had a well and it went dry, and we didn't have water for a week. And I mean, when that well goes dry and you turn the water on, it's like, oh no, what do we do? So it has a huge impact on your life when your well goes dry. I don't want to discount that, but we are seeing this trend, and the lack of recharge, or the lower than average recharge over the last 2 decades, is having an impact on water levels and groundwater. Some folks said, well, why is the groundwater declining? In the late 90s, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Water Resources Department, and the cities completed a groundwater study to analyze the inputs, outputs, where's the water going, how much is there, and then the connectedness between the upper Deschutes aquifer and the lower Deschutes River. Turns out that there's a really good connection between the upper Deschutes wells here and the lower Deschutes River. But that's a whole nother story, mitigation. But that study said that the majority of water use was with municipalities, and the other resort areas, golf courses. And it's actually a very small percentage of the overall use of water in Central Oregon. So it actually is a pretty small percentage, but they wanted to know, is it having an effect on the water levels? And at that time, it was pretty small, but it has grown over time, and it is increasing. So 2010 or so, folks were asking, why is the water table dropping? And the USGS updated that groundwater study to look at what were the causes. And they concluded that roughly 70% was due to the climate being drier than it had historically been over the previous 30 years. Next was increased pumping, roughly 20% of the impact, the decline, and then 10% was due to canal lining and piping. So the majority was climate, next was use, the last and least impact was due to canal lining and piping. So that's where we're at today. There's a couple things I just want to mention about the Habitat and Conservation Plan. It has extreme impacts to water management in Central Oregon. When I first started my career, the flow below Bend was supposed to be held at 30 cubic feet per second or less. Tumalo Creek and Deschutes Creek were dry in the summer, and the minimum outflow out of Wikiup Reservoir was 20 cubic feet per second. The Deschutes River Conservancy has had a huge impact on stream restoration on those locations. So now Tumalo Creek flows about 20 cubic feet per second. Deschutes Creek and Sisters flows between 20 and 40 cubic feet per second. And then the outflow out of Wikiup, the DRC did work on it. We didn't really make a lot of progress in that site, but the Habitat and Conservation Plan has required that that minimum outflow now be 100 cubic feet per second. And in the year 2028, the outflow will be 300 cubic feet per second. So going from 20 as a minimum to 100 now and then 300 in the future, that's going to have a huge impact on the North Unit Irrigation District's water supply. So maybe, these recent years, what we've seen, the reservoir being low, will probably become more common in the future. And so it might be something that we'll see more often. The hope is that in the Deschutes system, there's a lot of water. And it goes back to priority date and who gets water in times of shortages. So there's irrigation districts that divert the majority of the water out of the Deschutes River in the summer. There's a few irrigation districts that have senior priority dates to North Unit and the district North Unit that uses water out of Wikiup. So they rely on natural flow in the river, and they get most of their water from natural flow and rely very little on storage. Since North Unit was last in line, they get very little natural flow and have to rely on storage, i.e. Wikiup Reservoir. The hope is that those senior districts can pipe, do efficiency projects, do water transfers, and move water to North Unit so that North Unit becomes more reliant on the natural flow and less reliant on the reservoir, meaning that the outflow, the change in the management of the outflow of the reservoir will have less of an impact on North Unit supply. So that's currently what the big workload is for folks in the basin as far as the districts, Deschutes River Conservancy, Water Resources Department, making those transactions, making that movement of water from district to district easier and effective. And it's going to take a lot of work because water law, as you know, is over 100 years old. It's fairly clunky. It's been tweaked out here and there over the years, but it still has that fundamental basis of priority date, first in time, first in right. So we're working on that. We're trying to improve things, but it's going to take a lot of work with folks. And I am so pleased to have Emily. So I tried to do the things that she's doing, but I couldn't do a very good job because I had to manage people, take care of the Klamath, do other things. I just didn't have time to devote. But now I'm so pleased to have her because she can lift that burden off of me, and I can just comfortably sleep at night knowing that she's taking control of these things and moving the department along. So I think that's, well, Deschutes Crane Prairie, I already mentioned that, and then Crooked River. Crooked River is it would take a course of a 3 college credit course to solve or understand what's going on in the Crooked River. Just note that there are flows in the Crooked River that the system all used to be all for irrigation. Now there's water allocated to in-stream flows in the Crooked River, so for fish and wildlife purposes and for mitigation for other things. So it's really complicated, but if we can just get out of this drought we're in there and get that reservoir filled back up, things will be a little better on the Crooked Rivers. It was some historic low flows this year. The fishing had to be shut down because of the low flows. So devastating to Crook County, the irrigation district, and the recreation folks this year. So hopefully with a good snowpack, we'll get that reservoir filled back up and we'll be back in business. That was all that I wanted to present. Emily, do you want to say a few things, and then
Sure.
I'll take questions, take a little break. And I don't know what to tell you about that microphone. It is ornery.
I'll do my best. Well, thanks, Kyle, and thanks, everyone. I don't have much to add. I just wanted to highlight a few things that Kyle mentioned. He did, I think, a great job walking you through some of the really complex pieces of managing water in the Deschutes. There's a great amount of data and science that helps us make decisions. But there are factors that complicate things, right? That complicate how decisions are made or how water moves around. The Habitat Conservation Plan is a good example of that. Population growth and the demand on our groundwater systems is a good example of that. Another unique thing that we have in the Deschutes is a groundwater mitigation program. That's the only one in operation in the state. It's separate from those groundwater declines, though it serves a slightly different purpose. So there are all these different programs and initiatives going on that are kind of layered on to that data and science aspect, right? And Kyle mentioned my position. It's a new position with the agency. I'm very lucky to be joining the team, and I think it's a good thing that the agency is doing to try and look ahead to some of these challenges that we're facing that complicate water management and complicate how water is moved and used throughout the basin. And so right now, our team is working to prioritize how we can approach these various challenges from the state's perspective and how we can engage stakeholders throughout the basin to help inform some solutions. So our hope is that through this winter, we'll be sharing out where we can dedicate resources towards some of these challenges and work with folks within the basin to develop solutions together. So as we have those kind of set of projects, we look forward to be transparent about that and engage this group and others throughout the basin well into next year and beyond. So I just wanted to add some kind of next steps for you of what to expect from some of the information you heard today.
All right, so where do we start with questions? How about Molly?
I have a question. First of all, I thought that your presentation today was wonderful.
Oh, good, thank you.
I think you did a really, really good job of giving an overview and teaching us the things that are most important to know. So thank you for that. Here's the question. You talked a lot about long-term drought and low flows and things like that, but I never heard the words climate change. Is that something that your agency talks about relative to the conditions that we currently see?
Yes, our agency does look at climate change. I'm not an expert on climate change, so I don't talk about it. I hear, there are speculation about, what does the actual impacts mean, and is this climate change that we're seeing, or is it something else? just so you know, global climate change models predict that precipitation is gonna go up slightly. It's just that the temperatures also will go up, so we'll have less snow, but supposed to be more precipitation. Well, we haven't seen more precipitation here in Central Oregon, but you have to also think about, you know, if you think about the globe, the climate, or the entire globe, its entire climate, and so there are places where it is wetter, but there's, you know, one universal factor is it's warmer than it used to be. So, that's all I can tell you about that, so, yeah. Yes?
I remember reading in the bulletin in September that the Klamath Irrigation District refused to shut off the water and illegally sent public water down to farmers who were not authorized to use it. And that scares me. I'm thinking, is this going to be a trend that the irrigation districts just don't follow the rules? And what is being done to make sure that doesn't happen again?
The Klamath Basin.
Political question.
No, I'll take them. No, so the Klamath Basin has a much higher level of federal involvement in the management. They have multiple endangered species that the Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Marine Fisheries Service have to address. And the Klamath Basin is suffering a drought on par with what we're seeing here as well. And so water conditions down there are just as bad as they are here. Klamath Irrigation District, they're a little ornery. They serve a lot of land within the Klamath project area. So Upper Klamath Lake is a storage reservoir. It was a natural lake, but the Bureau put a dam on it, so they store, it's like Crescent Lake, but the water's not nearly as nice as Crescent Lake. But that storage is for the Klamath project, which is about 200,000 acres in Oregon and California. The Klamath Irrigation District operates the A Canal under contract with the Bureau of Reclamation. And so Klamath Irrigation District's the one that goes out there and makes the changes and does all the things that related to water delivery. They are in a dispute with who owns the water in Upper Klamath Lake. Is it theirs, or is it the Bureau's to release downstream for endangered species? So they're in the middle of lawsuits over that. They puffed out their chests and said, nope, we're not going to turn off. We're going to keep diverting our water. And the Bureau of Reclamation said, well, if you do that, you're not going to get any funds for drought relief or anything like that. And they said, they thought about it for a minute or two and said, okay, we'll turn off. So they actually didn't divert it. They didn't really do anything illegal. It was just that they were standing up and saying, we're going to assert our rights, because they do have a water right from Upper Klamath Lake. They have every right to divert it. It's just that because of low water conditions and the Bureau's obligation to meet in-stream flows and lake levels, there isn't any water for the irrigation districts. So that's what happened. Your fear that it might happen in the future, it could, but there's certainly a lot of hooks with the federal government in keeping those districts under control. Luckily in Central Oregon, we don't have districts like that. They're working together. They don't want to litigate. They want to solve problems by working together rather than litigate, which in the Klamath Basin, unfortunately, there's our agency is involved in numerous lawsuits down there, but we're not here. So, thankfully, yeah. Yeah. Somebody had one in the back? Okay, Bo next.
I'm interested in the whole water transfer process. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So there's four major principles of a water right. It's priority date, where is the water used, which is called appurtenancy. It's a fancy word for the water rights attached to the land. The rate that you can divert water, and then the source. And so in Oregon, you can take a water right and move it from one location to another, but you can't expand those parameters that I just mentioned. The acres, the rate, or the source. You can't change sources. So under Oregon water law, you can move water rights around. The great thing about when you move a water right is that it retains the priority date. The priority date doesn't change. And so if somebody buys a water right from their neighbor, they move it over and they retain that old priority date. The other good thing about this, and this is what the DRC has capitalized on, is the fact that you can also take a water right, retire it from the land, and put it in stream. And then once it's in stream, it has a competing priority date with the irrigation district, so it can be protected. And that's how the DRC has done a lot of stream restoration, is through transfers in stream and retaining that old priority date. So moving water in a district is actually pretty easy, you know, as long as it stays in the boundaries of the district. And they do this, hundreds and hundreds of acres every year are moved around in irrigation districts. What we're looking at is moving water rights from one district to another district. And it gets a little bit more complicated of how to do that. You can do it, but it's somewhat costly, and there is a process to have to go through the agency to do it, paperwork involved, money, all those sort of things. But it is possible. We're looking at how can we make those transactions smoother, less costly, and quicker. And so it's pretty complicated, but that's kind of the gist of water rights and movement of water. Does that answer your question? Okay, Bo, and then Linda.
Okay, yeah, this all started 100 years ago when you started measuring the water. And at that time, agriculture was the biggest user, and it still is, right?
That's correct.
But the reasons for agriculture have changed. I mean, 100 years ago, water was used for cattle, and now it's used for what? Besides cannabis.
Well, yeah. So Central Oregon was settled because of two things: timber and water.
Right.
In 1900, there was no electricity here, so all the irrigation was done by gravity through ditches, and that's why the canals are here in Bend, because Bend is the last place you can divert large quantities of water and irrigate land by gravity. So that's how we started out. And then 1910 or 11, the Pacific Power Dam on Mirror Palm was built, and then we had electricity in town. And then fast forward, 50, 70 years where electricity is very available and cost effective to start pumping. So when people moved here originally, there was no food. You couldn't just go to the store and get food. You had to grow your own food. So the water was used to grow food, crops, and feed for your livestock. If you didn't do it, you couldn't live here. You would die. So that was originally the intent of irrigation. Development of water in Central Oregon was to settle the West. Bo's question about today. Well, today, water, much of it is still used in the same fashion. Grow alfalfa, grow pasture. North Irrigation District has a variety of highly sophisticated seed crops. But the majority of water in Central Oregon is for cattle. The cows they don't drink so much water. They eat more than they drink water. So the water is used to grow food for cattle. Cannabis actually is a relatively new thing for use of water, and the amount it gets a lot of press, but it actually doesn't use that much water in relative terms compared to an alfalfa field or something. It doesn't use that much, but it is a use of water, and it is a problem because a lot of people that grow the marijuana don't go through the right avenues of getting the permits and all that sort of thing. So that's the problem, is the illegal use. But from a standpoint of where does it stack up in the quantity of water, it's actually fairly small amount. I don't know if that allays any of your fears, but anyway, that's yeah. And there's just all kinds of uses of water now. Lynn, you're next.
Yeah, I have a friend that lives in Redmond and has water rights on his property. He knew that he wouldn't need to use all the amount of water he can use. And so he called, I don't know who, but someone in the know of water rights, and said, I'm not going to use all the water that I could. Can that water be diverted to someone else, and would that help anything? and was told that, no, we can't do that. If you give up some of your water rights for 1 year, you give them up permanently. And so there was no accommodation.
You know, I've heard that story a few times about patrons wanting to use less water in the irrigation district, which 90 to 95% of the water that's diverted from the Deschutes River goes to irrigation districts. So on other stream systems, it's just private ditches, and it's up to the individual to manage the water. Whereas on the Deschutes, the majority of the water is diverted by irrigation districts. It's managed by the districts within the district and then delivered by them. So the folks that are, you know, there's thousands of patrons inside of all these districts. The management is controlled by the district. So a person that is within an irrigation district doesn't have the ultimate say in what happens. I know that there are stories out there about having to use all your water every year, which is actually not true. There's another fundamental principle of water right.
I knew that wasn't true.
Is that you only have to use it once beneficially every 5 years. So a patron in a district could use it one year and let it rest for 4 and then use it that 5th year. So that's possible. The other thing is that there's a big misunderstanding is that you have to use all your water. So irrigation districts deliver 3 to 5 acre feet per acre, and an acre foot is 1 foot of water on a 1 acre of land. And the districts get their duty is what it's called, is how much water you get over a season. And that duty, like I said, is between 3 and 5 acre feet per acre per landowner. You do not have to use all of that water to protect your water right. You can use 2 acre feet and grow a crop, and then say, hey, middle August, I'm done irrigating. I'm gonna go take a vacation, and so I'm gonna head out, and somebody else can use my water. So it's totally legal, won't affect your water right whatsoever. So that's part of that education campaign.
He knew that. He was just trying to be helpful.
Yeah. In the back, and then Becky.
I was just curious about the conflicts like Eagle Crest, that there's a development that's very controversial near there. I mean, how is it gonna be managed when this place grows the way it's growing? Is there ever gonna be enough water?
That's a good question. And so the development is called Thornburg. And it is, so Eagle Crest is on the northeast and east side of Klein Buttes. This development's looking at developing on the south and southwest side of that butte, so just on the other side. And the owner has been attempting to develop it for over 15 years now. There's a lot of opposition to it. And getting through the land use process has been a challenge, and then the water has also been a challenge. The graph I showed of the 30-foot decline, that extends to the area where they're proposed to build Thornburg. And so Eagle Crest is also in that area where the water levels are declining. So our department is looking at what are we going to do with groundwater levels declining in places. Are we going to issue more water rights or not? Are we going to stop issuing water rights? Are we going to start curtailing groundwater use because of those declining water levels? So we are actually, our agency is right in the middle of a new look at how we're allocating groundwater. And there was a meeting at the end of September here in Central Oregon to solicit citizen input on our new process. And I don't know if anybody attended or heard about it or anything like that. So we had 5 of those around the state where the state's looking at what are we going to do with declining groundwater levels. So they're in the mix. This development's in the mix of what are we going to do. So Becky, you had a question.
I was just wondering about your regulatory authority with wells and irrigation districts, and how much power do you have to shut things down if they're doing something illegal or bad for the community?
Okay.
Repeat the question, please.
What's the question?
So she asked, what does the Water Resources Department have as far as regulatory authority over the use of water, wells, or surface water, or illegal use? Believe it or not, there's several chapters in the Oregon Revised Statutes that allow a water master. I used to be a water master for a while, but the water master can go out to somebody's property and say, you are not using your water under the terms of your water right, and I'm going to shut you off. And we can do that.
Have you?
Yes. Well, yeah, we do this, hundreds of regulations a year. Normally, people say, oh, I didn't know I was violating the terms of my water right. And oh, okay, I'll fix it. And then that's the end of it. That's the majority of our interactions with citizens. Typically, they don't know that they're doing something wrong. And typically it's irrigating land that isn't, so water right is pertinent to the land, right? It's in a certain shape. It used to be a square field, then they put a center pivot in, and now they're irrigating the circle and not irrigating the outside. So they need to file a transfer and move that water around to where they're currently irrigating. So that's the majority of encounters. Or people using water that don't have a water right, they didn't know they needed one. And then we have laws behind us. We can actually go assess civil penalties if it gets to that point where we've repeatedly said, you can't do that, you're not supposed to do that. We can file a notice of violation and then go to civil penalties, and we've done that too. So,
Does that same, do those same principles apply to large developments that are proposed for new housing that would take up a lot of water usage?
yes, the question was, well, does that law apply to new housing development? And yes, it applies to cities too. So, a water right, I mentioned, has a rate. And so a development will have a water right, and it'll say they can pump this much water. If we find out that they're pumping more than their water right, we'll go to them and say, you've got to cut your rate down back to your water right. And we are fully within the law to do that sort of thing. So even in, a city might be drawing too much water out, pumping too much. We can go to the city and say, hey city, you're pumping too much water, or you're diverting too much water. You have to cut that back. I can't even think of where a city has been doing something illegal. They're not the bad apples. They have staff, they have, the public image they have to keep up. They don't want to have a black mark. Well, the Water Resources regulated them off. So generally we don't deal with cities in that aspect. It's the rural community where somebody's bought a piece of property in their heaven, and they go, oh man, I'm going to do so much here, and they change things around and not realizing that they're violating law.
Is this water metered? When you have a right, do you have a meter so you can check to see how much they use?
Not all. The question was, is water metered? So most old water rights don't have a requirement for a meter. I'm trying to think, probably in the mid-1990s, when we were still issuing water rights, that requirement for a meter was added to the water right condition. And since the mid-90s, any new water right that gets issued today has a requirement for measurement, monitoring, conservation plans, all kinds of stuff. So a lot has changed in 30 years as far as water.
Would a farmer have a meter?
Some do. Probably Central Oregon, individual farms, they have a weir or a meter. I can't tell you how many it is percentage-wise have. North Unit Irrigation District, I do know this, that all the head gates to all the farm deliveries are all locked. And there's weirs, and the district manages all of the deliveries in North Unit because of the scarcity issue. The other districts, Arnold Irrigation District went through a transformation in 1995, and they didn't hardly have any measurement. And then after 1995, they installed locked head gates on every delivery and got rid of the ones that were pipes stuck in the canal that they didn't know about. So Arnold's changed. The other districts are mixed. Some deliveries are measured, some aren't. You had a question then?
Have you been hearing any substantive conversation about looking at beneficial uses today? Because the rights are conditional based on their use, and what was, beneficial in 1900 maybe isn't, like golf courses and so forth. Are you hearing that kind of examination go on to managing water?
Yeah, the beneficial use is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. And it's a gray area. So yes, people have talked about, hey, shouldn't we take a look at beneficial use and maybe make the standard a little stricter? Those sort of discussions. That would be a really hard nut to crack, is beneficial use and what constitutes beneficial use or not. But the discussions are going on, given the scarcity of water.
Yeah.
Within irrigation districts, is it the individuals that own the water rights, or is it the irrigation district that can transfer water between their members however they like?
Good question. In an irrigation district, who owns the water right? So believe it or not, there was a court case down in Southern Oregon, and I can always have a hard time remembering what the name of that was, but it was one of the irrigation districts. A patron inside that irrigation district wanted to move his point of diversion to the river because his property was next to the river and didn't want to mess with the district anymore. And our department approved that transfer. And the irrigation district said, whoa, wait a minute. We can't have people start transferring their water rights out of our district. We'll lose revenue. And so they sued our department, and it went to the Oregon Supreme Court, and Oregon Supreme Court said, nope, whoever name is on the water right has a say and a stake in what happens in that water right. I wish I could remember that court case. It starts with an F, but I can't remember it. But anyway, so what happens is a patron inside of a district owns the land, the water rights attached to the land, but the irrigation district's name is on the certificate. So there's a shared responsibility between the district and the patron over the water right, and neither has an outright say in what can happen to that water right. Yes.
So this is a really basic question. As I've been exploring water in Central Oregon, I discovered there's all kinds of players. And there are several groups I'm particularly confused about in terms of where they get their authority, where they get their funding, and whom they answer to. And I'm thinking specifically about irrigation districts, water purveyors such as Avion, the Deschutes River Conservancy, and water masters. So how do all of these relate? Where do they get their money? Whom they answer to? Where they get their authority?
You started out a very basic question. So for the Oregon Water Resources Department, the majority of our budget comes from the Oregon State General Fund. And so the legislature and the governor have a role in how much funding Oregon Water Resources Department gets. So
The easy ones.
that's the easy one. So irrigation districts, their funding comes from the patrons. They pay assessments and fees, and that goes into the operation of an irrigation district. The Deschutes River Conservancy works on grants.
So it's an NGO?
Yes, the Deschutes River Conservancy has no regulatory authority whatsoever. It's a nonprofit and is grant supported. Avion is also a customer base. They're regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. The PUC regulates their rates and how they operate. The Oregon Health Authority has oversight to make sure that they deliver clean, good water and have adequate pressure to the patrons. Oregon Water Resources Department operates under statutes, state statutes that are granted or approved by the legislature. Who was the last group?
Well, the water master, I assume, is a state entity.
Yeah, so Water Master is a state water Resources Department employee.
Okay.
The Water Masters prior to 1962 used to be funded by the counties, and that program was taken over by the state in 1962.
So like Avion and I guess Bend Water would be a municipality, so it's a
Yes.
governmental oversight.
Yes, yeah.
Is, for example, Avion subject to open information laws where they need, I mean.
Oh, well, that
this
part
is
I
like
don't know.
that.
I don't know the answer to that.
And
That's a legal
while
question.
your questions are excellent, we've promised to keep them finished at 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
Unless we wanna do water 201, then we'll move on, but, so, I guess if you have other questions, we'll do another 5 minutes?
Sure, that's
Okay.
fine, yeah. I have more time.
I know that the people who have water rights can irrigate their hay and alfalfa, and it's perfectly fine. But it bothers me that 25% of the alfalfa and 50% of the hay grown in Oregon is exported to Southeast Asia, and it seems to me a misuse of our Deschutes River.
Yeah, it's a good point.
In all of this talk, there's no mention of the rights of Indians that are covering this area. Where do they stand with the rights of the water?
The question was about the area, the local tribes and their water rights. So another neat thing about the Deschutes Basin is, and the Warm Springs tribes have been a great partner, especially in the water arena. We've worked with them a lot. So in the late 80s into the mid 90s, the Water Resources Department and the Warm Springs tribe entered into negotiations over their water rights. And in 1997, the negotiations culminated into a settlement for the Warm Springs tribes. So the Warm Springs have the oldest water right in the basin. That's established. They have in-stream flow levels on the Metolius River and the Lower Deschutes River that runs along the reservation area. They also have a consumptive use water right of 200 cubic feet per second for the streams adjacent to the reservation or on the reservation. And all those water rights are, in the Klamath, the term is time immemorial, but in the settlement, their rights are described as the oldest water rights, just left it at that. They are the oldest water rights. And that 1997 settlement was incorporated into the Deschutes River Decree in the early 2000s. So the great thing about that is those water rights are quantified and they're known and established, and that is such a benefit to what we do with water and how we manage water in Central Oregon. Because in the Klamath Basin, they are not settled yet. The department issued a findings of fact and final order of determination, which is a fancy word for the department's administrative process of issuing water rights, preliminary water rights. These are going through an adjudication in the Klamath presently. The Water Resources Department in 2013 handed over the process to the Circuit Court in Klamath County. And now the adjudication's in Klamath County Circuit Court. And so the judge down there at some point in the future, and I certainly won't be working for the Water Resources Department when that comes out. But sometime in the future, a decree will come out from Klamath County, the Circuit Court, saying how much the tribe's water rights are for in-stream uses, how much are the irrigation district's water rights, all the folks that have pre-1909 water rights in that basin. So that'll be at some point. And then the Umatilla Indians are going through negotiations right now with our department, but that's out of my area, so I don't really track it too well.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you very much. Thank you for all your great work.